Hello everyone, my name is David Webb, and today we're going to be talking about 10 things that you can do right now to make the first chapter of your book the best it can be. Let's get started. Welcome back everyone, my name is David Webb and I made this channel to give you the best tips on writing and creativity so you can finally finish that book or have that creative career you've always dreamed of. But how are you going to finish your book if you don't start strong? So today we're talking about the 10 ways that you can make the beginning of your book the best it can be. And if you've already written that first chapter, if you've already started your book, be sure to watch this video anyway, because there are going to be tips in here that will make your first chapter even better. First chapters are incredibly important. They are the most important chapter of your book. The first chapter is what is going to sell your book to your reader, your agent, your publisher, everyone. This is the chapter that you need to spend the most time on out of any single chapter in your entire book. So how do you do the first chapter right and make sure you start off strong? I'm glad you asked. Tip number 1. The first line is one of the most important sentences in your book. There are some readers who won't even read the first chapter if you start weak. So because this is such an important topic, I'll make another video about it. What I want you to do right now is write your first chapter and completely ignore the first line. Because trust me, you will obsess about your first line, and you should, just not right now. You will get hung up on your first line, and it will actually prevent you from writing the rest of the book. Come back to it at a later date once you know how you want to start, once you have a good idea of how the rest of the novel is going to go. That way you can start with maximum impact. So that killer first line, that amazing hook, save it for another time. Tip number 2, introduce your main character and save the cat. When you introduce your main character, make sure you start with a very clear starting point for the main character. You really want that character's state of being to be mirrored at the end of the novel. Imagine the first and last chapter of your book as mirrored bookends on a bookshelf. They're not exactly the same, but they reflect each other. They very clearly show how each other is similar but different. Everything in the middle is important, but those first and last chapters need to clearly identify the character and their arc. Part 2 of tip 2 is save the cat, which means to make the reader care about the main character. Books are character-centric. People need someone to care about, someone to follow. The main character can be a total scumbag, a jerk, but the reader needs to care about the main character. They won't care about the plot if they don't care about the character. Saving the cat is merely a way of saying, have your main character do something that garners sympathy, garners empathy from the reader, such as literally saving a cat. Something that is so undeniably good that you can't help but feel a little empathy for the main character. This is a great way to start off strong and have a character that someone can instantly relate to. Next up, number 3 is you want to disrupt the main character. A lot of writers love to start their novels by showing their main character in their everyday life. The problem is, that's boring. No one wants to read about everyday life, or otherwise they wouldn't be reading your book. This is a very tricky balance, and you have to proceed carefully because it is okay and healthy to show your main character in their everyday state and then disrupt it, so you can show just how drastically the character's world changes. Next up, introduce the antagonist and the promise of conflict. I'm not saying put your villain or put your bad guy in the very first chapter of your book. In fact, you could say that's a bad idea. You want the first chapter to mainly focus on the main character, but you want to be clear who the main character is up against. Not necessarily the actual person, but the system, what the antagonist represents. You want to give the reader some hint of what this antagonist is going to be like, more or less foreshadowing the kind of stakes that the main character is going to have to face. Along those lines, you're going to want to at least hint at the main conflict. Conflict is one of the most important factors of any story. It is the driving force behind the narrative. If the character's world hasn't been disrupted yet, you can show the main conflict and hint at the main character's involvement, or you can directly call out the antagonist and therefore imply that the main character is going to have conflict with that person, or you can have a related but not identical conflict in the first chapter that hints at the larger conflict. Tip number 5 is avoid exposition like the plague. Chapter 1 of your book should not be an info dump. A lot of authors do this, and it's a mistake just about every time. Really, none of your book should be an info dump, but especially the first chapter. This is not the time to go into the lengthy history of your world. This is not the time to explain your main character's history. You want to introduce just enough details to keep the reader wondering, to keep them curious. But if you just tell them everything right off the bat, it's not going to be interesting, and the reader will forget it. So do yourself a favor and keep the details to a minimum. If you're still watching, thank you for sticking with me. Do me a favor and hit the like button and comment your favorite tip so far. If you're not already subscribed to this channel, please do me a favor and hit that button right now. I try to post new videos every single week on how to make your writing even better than I know it already is. Next up, include a captivating setting, but do not dwell on the details. Again, related to the last tip, do not spend any length of time really going into detail about your setting, but you do want to establish it because it gives your story context. Also, if it's an interesting setting, then it can serve as another way to hook the reader. Next tip is to start as close to the inciting incident as possible. For those of you unfamiliar with the term, the inciting incident is simply the plot point that kicks off the novel. This is what really sets the main character on their path. If you can do this in chapter 1, great. Or at the very least, include an inciting incident in your first chapter that leads to the real inciting incident of the novel. Basically, the closer that you can start to the actual story, the better. Consider starting in medias res, that is, in the middle of things. You can start when your story has already started. It's a great way to just jump into the story without wasting any time on any exposition, any foreshadowing, just jump right in there. This can be a little tricky and I don't necessarily recommend it to all new writers, but what I do recommend is starting your novel as close to the inciting incident as possible. Next up, you want to set the tone. This one's pretty simple, should really be common sense. If you have a dramatic story, don't start on a comedic note. You'll instantly turn the reader off and they won't continue the book. So make sure the tone of your first chapter lines up with the tone of the entire book. Next up, you want to hint at the theme of the book. Theme is a very powerful tool. And going back to the arc of your main character, you also want to bookend your book. You also want to bookend your novel with the theme. That way, when you start with the theme, either implicitly or explicitly stated, it's in the back of the reader's mind, and that's how they view the rest of the book, through the lens of the theme. This is a great way to make every single chapter of your book more powerful, because the theme is in the back of the reader's mind, influencing how they see the rest of the novel. Finally, you want to end strong. The end of your first chapter must make the reader continue. It must beg the reader to turn the page. If you've got them to read until the end of the first chapter, that's great. That's an accomplishment all on its own. But if you don't end that first chapter strong, that first chapter is a great place for the reader to drop the book. And trust me, it's in the back of each reader's mind. They're looking for an excuse not to read your book. Nobody will admit it, and really nobody even realizes it, but it's true. Don't give your reader an excuse to put the book down. End your first chapter strong with intrigue, mystery, tragedy, something that demands the reader to continue. Before we wrap up, I just want to give a quick word on prologues. This again deserves a video on its own, but I'll just say right now, a good general rule of thumb regarding prologues is don't write one, unless you're in the middle of a series. There are a lot of reasons not to open your book with a prologue. And if you go back and watch this video again, you'll realize that I've sprinkled a lot of them throughout this video. I'll get into that another time, but I didn't want to end this video on first chapters without a quick note on prologues. And that's 10 tips on how to make the beginning of your book the best it can possibly be. With that, I want to announce a brand new video series that I'm going to be starting on this channel here pretty soon. I'm going to be going through every single chapter of my first book, The Light Thief, walking you through what I think worked, what I think maybe didn't work, using my book to illustrate writing techniques that you can use in your writing. A lot of writing educators use other people's books in a very similar way. However, the problem is that they use other people's books, which means that the professor or instructor could see meaning where there is none, or misinterpret the author's meaning. Well, no one knows my books better than I do. I highly recommend picking up a copy of my book so you can follow along with me. For your sake, I've discounted the cost of the ebook to 99 cents for the entirety of next week, so you can pick it up for dirt cheap. Trust me, this is not my way of selling books. I get like a quarter for each book you buy. So for those of you who pick it up, thank you. I'll be able to get a cup of coffee. Don't miss out on this because the very first video will be going over my first chapter, believe it or not. So you'll be able to take this video and see how I applied everything that I just talked about and use it in my first chapter. I'm really excited for this series, so be sure to pick up your copy so we can go through it together. At long last, that is going to be it from me today. Thank you again for joining me. Can't wait to see you all again and get some writing done.